Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatore. So this is a genuinely short Matt Easton video, which makes it a fairly rare thing in itself. But I saw a discussion today on a Facebook group, on a HEMA Facebook group, where someone made the assertion that there is no such thing as a side sword, there are only rapiers. Well, is that true? I can kind of see where they're coming from. So the problem is that side sword is more or less a modern term. Not to say that the terminology of spada da lata or weapon worn at the side isn't very occasionally, very rarely it has to be said, used in period 16th century sources. It occasionally comes up, but it's really just referring to a sword that's worn at your side. It's not talking about a specific type of sword. So the question is that are developed hilt cut and thrust swords of the 16th century all rapiers? Now that is where I would say no. And the reason that I would say that is because we have numerous sources that refer to sword, spada, for example, or in English, sword, and they refer to rapiers, and they differentiate between those two things. And I'm just going to pick on one example, which is Joseph Swetnam. Now, Joseph Swetnam is fairly late, actually, for the period that we're talking about. He's from about 1617, if I remember correctly. And Joseph Swetnam talks about short swords, long swords. I've spoken about this previously. It doesn't mean a two-handed sword. It means a sword with a long blade. And rapiers. And he talks about the long sword and the rapier sometimes interchangeably, but sometimes he differentiates between them. So it's very clear to, at least in the case of Joseph Swetnam, that as far as he was concerned, a rapier and a long-bladed sword were not exactly the same thing. Equally, if we go quite a bit earlier to around 1570, if we look at Joachim Meyer, then he has the rapier, and again we get into the problems here of terminology, and his rapier is more like what we would call a side sword. It's a relatively simple hilted cut and thrust sword that doesn't appear to be particularly long. So the basic point that I want to make here is that we can't say that all developed hilt swords of the 16th and early 17th century are rapiers. We can't really say that because it's very clear that in various parts of Europe at that time, they made what was a rapier, whatever someone considered a rapier, wasn't always, and in fact very often wasn't, the same thing as a sword, whatever they considered a sword was. And it does seem maybe that certainly within English-speaking countries, a rapier was a more thrust-centric thing and a sword was a cut and thrust thing. Not to say that rapiers can't also cut, yes they can. So they weren't all rapiers, but they were all swords. And then we also have to mention, of course, that in the Italian rapier treatises, the majority of them just refer to the spada, the sword. So there we go. We're left really nowhere useful. We can't say that all of those swords were rapiers. We can say that they were all swords. Should we call them side swords? That's the final question to address. I would say yes, because it's a useful term. In the same way that Ewart-Oakeshot's typology for medieval blades is a completely modern thing, or at least sort of since the 1960s, but it is a useful thing. So if I talk about a Type 10 Viking era sword, you all know what I'm talking about. You should do by now. If you don't, get Googling. But it is a useful terminology. So regardless of whether a side sword is a subjective term or whether it's a modern term or an old term, it is useful. And it is useful, in my opinion, to be able to differentiate between a thing that is commonly recognised as what we would describe as a side sword. Hello Oscar, thanks for your contribution to the video. I know you'll love that. And what we consider a rapier, because we know what that means. And at the end of the day, language is all about communication. So if we communicate information with one of those terms, then everyone's a winner. Cheers for watching. I'll see you soon for another video. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.